The first thing they told us when they dropped us on Cathara 9 was real simple. Don't get separated from the group. That's it, that was the big safety briefing. 4 years of frontier survey training, 2 years of cold weather survival school, 18 months of alien contact protocol, and what it all boiled down to was 2 words from Commander Ithari of the Veldrani Coalition survey team: don't get separated. I should have listened. But here's the thing about blizzards: they don't ask for your opinion first. My name is Deven Marsh, Corporal 14th Frontier Survey Corps, born in Nagpur, India. Raised partly in Calgary, Canada, which, as it turns out, was maybe the single most useful piece of biographical trivia I've ever carried in my chest, because Calgary winters are no joke. My dad used to say that Canadian cold doesn't warn you. It doesn't build up slowly. It just arrives one morning like a bill you forgot you owed, and it starts collecting immediately. Cathara 9 cold was different, though. I want to be precise about this, because I've told this story a few times now, and people always nod like they understand when I say cold, but they don't. Not until I explain it right. The average winter temperature on Cathara 9 northern ice shelf sits at around -62°C. And I don't mean in a blizzard. I mean on a Tuesday, on a normal, boring, nothing-happening Tuesday, -62. The atmosphere is breathable by human standards, just barely, but the moisture content in the air is about 30% higher than Earth's, which means the cold doesn't just sit on your skin. It soaks. It gets into the layers. It moves through your insulation like it's got somewhere to be. The Veldrani, our alien survey partners on this mission, they're from a binary star system about 40 light-years out. Their homeworld runs at an average surface temperature of 12°C, which is basically a cool spring day in Europe. So Cathara 9 in winter hit them roughly the same way Nagpur in summer hits a penguin. They had environmental suits, obviously. Full thermal regulation, atmospheric scrubbers, the whole setup. But thermal suits don't fix the psychological part. The Veldrani are, fundamentally, warm-blooded creatures with a deep and ancient instinct that says, extreme cold equals death. That instinct, useful back home. On Cathara 9, it became a problem. The mission was supposed to be a 9-day grid survey of Sector 7 on the northern shelf. The Veldrani Coalition had detected subsurface thermal signatures that suggested geothermal activity, potentially a liquid water layer beneath the ice, which, in the galactic scientific community, is basically the equivalent of finding a gold rush. Liquid water under ice means microbial life. Microbial life means the planet's not dead. And a living planet, even a barely living planet, on the edge of Coalition exploration territory. That changes everything about how the territory gets classified, developed, managed. Earth's Frontier Survey Corps had been invited to co-run the mission for one specific reason: cold weather operational expertise. The Veldrani had the technology and the funding. We had the people who knew how to work in environments that were trying to actively kill you. There were 8 of us on the survey team total. 3 Veldrani, Commander Ithari, Science Lead Osavith, and Equipment Specialist Farron. 2 humans from my unit, myself and Sergeant Priya Salve, who'd grown up in Shimla and done her cold training in Siberia. Then 2 more aliens I'll get to in a moment, a pair of Gesari observers, tall, quiet creatures who moved like they were always slightly underwater. And finally, the one human who wasn't part of my unit, but who ended up being the most important person on that entire shelf. Dr. Casalera, xenogeologist, civilian contractor, originally from Reykjavik, Iceland. I did not like Casalera when we first met. I'll be honest about that. She showed up to the pre-mission briefing at the Ketharan base station wearing a beat-up orange parka that looked like it had survived multiple catastrophes, carrying a battered field notebook, paper, actual paper, which nobody uses anymore. And she kept interrupting Commander Ithari to correct his pronunciation of geological terms. She had this way of talking that was very flat and very certain, like she'd already run the numbers on every possible outcome, and was mildly annoyed that the rest of us hadn't caught up yet. I remember thinking, this woman is going to be a problem. I was right, just not in the way I expected. We deployed on day 1 under clear skies, which on Cathara 9 meant a pale lavender-gray light that fell in sheets rather than rays. The planet's sun, it's actually a binary system, a large orange dwarf and a much smaller companion, sat low on the horizon and basically stayed there. Full daylight on the northern shelf at this latitude was about 4 hours. The rest of the time, you were working in a kind of dim, constant dusk that played tricks with distance and depth. The ice shelf itself was beautiful if you can set aside the fact that it wanted you dead. It wasn't the flat, featureless ice plain I'd imagined. It had character. It had ridges and pressure formations, places where ancient ice plates had collided and folded up into jagged walls 20 meters high. There were natural corridors between formations, some of them wide enough to drive a vehicle through, some of them barely shoulder width. The Veldrani field maps were good, but not perfect. They'd been generated from orbital surveys and couldn't account for the small-scale topography that matters when you're on foot. Dr. Alara was ahead of us most of the day. She moved fast for someone carrying 40 kilos of field gear. She'd stop every 50 meters or so, pull out that paper notebook, scratch something down, then look up and start moving again like she was navigating by something only she could see. By midday, she'd already identified 3 potential drill sites that Commander Ithari's orbital analysis had missed. By afternoon, I had stopped being annoyed at her and started being quietly impressed. Quietly, I wasn't going to say anything. Day 3 was when things changed. We'd made it 22 kilometers into the survey grid, deeper into the northern shelf than any coalition expedition had previously reached. The subsurface thermal readings were getting stronger. Osavith, the science lead, was barely containing his excitement. Veldrani don't emote the way humans do, exactly, but there's a specific thing they do with their secondary eyelids, a kind of rapid flutter, when they're excited. Osavith had been doing that flutter for about 6 hours straight by day 3 afternoon. Then the weather shifted. Commander Ithari's atmospheric sensors picked it up first. A pressure drop of about 14% in 40 minutes. He announced it in that calm, modulated Veldrani communication style they have, no urgency, no alarm, just information, stated flat. Weather formation developing approximately 60 kilometers northwest. Ketharan classification, Category 4 atmospheric convergence. Recommend immediate shelter protocol. I looked at Priya. Priya looked at me. Category 4 on Cathara 9. In Earth terms, roughly equivalent to a hurricane, except instead of wind and rain, you get wind and ice particles traveling at speeds that can sand the finish off a titanium hull plate in about 90 minutes. How long do we have? I asked. Projection suggests convergence with our position in approximately 4 hours, Ithari said. 4 hours is enough to reach base camp 2, Priya said, if we move now. Agreed, Ithari said. We begin immediate withdrawal. He turned to the group, gave the order, everyone started packing up. I went looking for Cass Ilera. She wasn't where I'd last seen her. It took me 8 minutes to find her, which is 8 minutes I'll spend the rest of my life thinking about. She'd gone 50 meters off the main survey path to look at a pressure ridge formation she'd noticed in the afternoon light. She was standing at the base of it with her notebook open, running her gloved hand along the ice face, looking at the layering in the strata like she was reading a sentence written 1,000,000 years ago. Dr. Ilera. One moment. Dr. Ilera, we have a Category 4 convergence. We need to move, right now. She looked up, not at me, at the sky. Her expression did something complicated. I've thought about that expression a lot since. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like recognition. Like someone who's been in enough bad situations to know immediately when they're in another one. How long? 4 hours. Less if the projection's off. Right, she closed the notebook. Didn't hesitate after that, started moving. We made it back to the group in 6 minutes. Ithari had them assembled and ready. We started north toward base camp 2. That's when Farron, the equipment specialist, took stock of the gear sleds and said the sentence that changed everything. The secondary drill unit, it is not present. What? I secured it to survey sled 3 this morning. It is no longer attached. Everyone stopped, because the secondary drill unit wasn't just equipment. It was the backup for the primary geothermal drill, the one we'd be using at the strongest thermal site on day 5. Without the secondary, if the primary failed, the mission ended. The coalition had spent 400 million credits getting us to this shelf. The secondary drill unit cost about 60 million of that. More importantly, without it the mission ended. 18 months of preparation, The water beneath ice discovery, all of it. Commander Ithari was quiet for a moment. Then, we cannot return for it. Retrieval would require 4 individuals and 40 minutes minimum. With the current convergence trajectory, that window has closed. I know where it is, Cass said. Everyone looked at her. When we crossed the eastern pressure corridor at midday, I heard the gear lock ping on sled 3. It shook loose on the ice step. I didn't say anything because I assumed someone would notice on equipment check. She paused. I should have said something. That's approximately 3 kilometers back, Priya said. 2.8, Cass said. I know the route. The route back takes you through the eastern corridor, I said. If the convergence comes in ahead of schedule. Then I don't make it back to base camp too, Cass said, flat, certain, like she'd already run the numbers. But there are emergency shelter caches marked on my field GPS. There's one at the eastern corridor midpoint, rated for Category 5. Category 5, I said. We're dealing with Category 4. So I'll be comfortable, she said. That wasn't a joke. That was just Cass Alara's version of reassurance. What happened next is the part I've relived maybe 400 times in the 14 days since it happened. Commander Ithari made the call. He designated it a voluntary solo retrieval. No mission member could be ordered to return into the convergence path. Cass volunteered before he finished the sentence. Ithari gave her the updated weather projection, a beacon transponder, and a survival pack rated for 72 hours. I started to say I'd go with her. Priya grabbed my arm. She knows the route, Priya said quietly. 2 people moving slower through that corridor is more dangerous than 1 person moving fast. You know that. I did know that. I hated knowing that. Cass was already moving. She looked back just once, and said, Don't wait for me, I know where the camp is. And she walked back into the gray. We made it to base camp 2 in 3 hours and 14 minutes. The blizzard hit 47 minutes later. I don't have words for what a Category 4 Ketharan convergence actually looks like from inside a shelter. I'll try anyway. You know the sound a jet engine makes on a runway, that sustained, overwhelming roar that makes conversation impossible and thought difficult. Now triple it and add the sound of 10,000 small rocks being thrown against a metal wall simultaneously. And underneath all of that, this low, structural groaning, like the planet itself, is reminding you it's bigger than you and always will be. Commander Ithari activated the emergency beacon protocol. We sent a recovery signal on all active frequencies and waited for Cass's transponder to ping back. Nothing. We waited longer. Still nothing. After 6 hours, with the storm showing no sign of breaking, Osavith said the thing everyone had been thinking. He said it in that flat, informational Veldrani way that doesn't understand how brutal flat information can be. Human survival threshold in Category 4 conditions without shelter, approximately 90 minutes. Dr. Alara has been outside shelter for over 7 hours. Statistical probability of survival has reached threshold minimum. Nobody said anything. Osavith, to his credit, seemed to realize he'd said something wrong even if he couldn't identify exactly what. His secondary eyelids flickered. Then he said, I did not intend to cause distress. We know, Priya said. I was staring at the transponder monitor. 90 minutes, 7 hours. I thought about her orange parka, the paper notebook, the way she'd run her hand along the ice face like she was reading something. I kept the monitor on all night. The blizzard ran for 31 hours. 31 hours. That's a long time to sit in a shelter with your thoughts and a transponder monitor and the sound of the planet trying to come through the walls. Around hour 9, Farron quietly began composing what the Veldrani call a testimonial of passage, basically their version of a formal acknowledgement that someone has died. I didn't say anything. Ithari was running mission failure calculations. The Gesari observers sat in the corner, still and silent, which seemed to be how they processed everything. Priya came and sat next to me at some point. She didn't say anything for a while, then she said, she knew what she was doing. Yeah, I said. She went in with a plan. Yeah. Priya let the silence sit between us for a bit. Then, I've been in 3 Category 3 storms and 2 Category 4s. I know what those survival margins look like. Deven, 90 minutes is the average threshold. Someone who knows what they're doing with the right kit, who knows the terrain. She was on that shelf for 3 days, I said. That's barely long enough to learn your way around. She had the GPS markers, Priya said. She had the shelter cache coordinates. She was moving before Ithari finished his sentence. I looked at her. She grew up in Iceland, I said slowly. Priya nodded. I looked it up during the flight here. You know the average January temperature in Reykjavik's interior highlands. Tell me. -15 to -25. And they get storms, sustained wind events, ice conditions, whiteouts. It's not Cathara 9, but it's not nothing either. I thought about that. That doesn't, I started. I know, Priya said. I know it doesn't change the numbers. I'm just saying she knew what she was walking into. She chose it. She wasn't impulsive. She was calculated. She paused. That woman does not do anything without running the numbers first. She was right. I knew she was right. I kept the monitor on anyway. Hour 22. The storm was still roaring. The shelter walls were vibrating at a frequency that made your back teeth ache if you paid attention to it for too long. Commander Ithari had made contact with the orbital support station. They were aware of the situation, but extraction was impossible until the storm broke. Their instruments confirmed the convergence was tracking as a Category 4 but had expanded in scale since initial detection. Larger than projected, moving slower than projected. Osivith's survival threshold estimate had assumed 90 minutes of exposure, but if Cass had made it to the emergency shelter cache before the storm fully converged, which was theoretically possible if she'd moved fast enough, then the calculation changed entirely. The shelter cache was rated for Category 5. It had 7 days of emergency rations, a heating unit with a 48-hour power cell, a localized atmospheric processor. The problem was, the shelter cache was also shielded, designed specifically to minimize energy signature to prevent interference with survey equipment. Which meant, and this is the part that had been eating at me for 22 hours, the transponder signal might not be able to punch through the cache's shielding from inside. I'd thought about this a lot. A quiet shelter looks exactly like a dead human if you're only looking at the transponder monitor. I said this to Ithari around hour 22. He considered it for a long time. Then he said, the probability assessment I made was based on exposure data. If the subject reached the shelter cache in time, the probability assessment does not apply. So she could be fine, I said. She could be fine, he agreed. Or she could not have made the cache in time. Right. Corporal Marsh, he said, and something in his voice was slightly different, slightly less modulated, like he was working to maintain the flatness of it and not quite succeeding. What is your assessment? You know this person better than I do. I thought about the orange parka, the paper notebook, the way she'd said so I'll be comfortable about a Category 5 shelter in a Category 4 storm. She made the cache, I said. I didn't know that, but I said it like I did. Hour 31. The storm broke at 3:47 local time. It didn't fade slowly. It stopped. One moment the walls were vibrating and the roaring was constant and the world was white chaos, and then nothing. Silence. The specific, weighted silence of post-storm Cathara that felt like the planet had exhaled. Commander Ithari was on the comms immediately. Orbital support confirmed conditions were now safe for ground movement. Extraction team could reach us within 3 hours. Before extraction, I said, we need a ground team to the eastern corridor. Ithari looked at me. The mission parameters. Before extraction, I said again. I wasn't shouting. I was very quiet, actually. Sometimes quiet is louder than shouting. Ithari looked at me for a moment with those wide Veldrani eyes. Then he said, I will lead the retrieval team personally. Priya was already pulling on her outer layers. The 2 Gesari observers stood up without being asked. They'd barely spoken for 31 hours, and I didn't know their names yet. They went by designations in the mission paperwork. But they stood up and started gearing up, and that meant something to me. Farron put down the testimonial of passage he'd been composing. He put it down deliberately, face down on the equipment crate. And then he started suiting up too. We moved out at 4:12 local time. Post-storm Cathara 9 is different from pre-storm. The Category 4 had rearranged the shelf. Pressure ridges that had been a meter high when we'd crossed them 2 days ago were now 3 meters. Corridors that had been open were drifted over. New formations had appeared where flat ground had been. The topography had changed. But the GPS coordinates of the emergency shelter cache hadn't. We found the eastern corridor 62 minutes after leaving Base Camp 2. There was a drift at the entrance, maybe 4 meters of accumulated ice and powder that the storm had piled up against the corridor mouth. But beyond it, the corridor was intact. The walls had protected it from the worst of the deposition. We dug through the drift in 20 minutes. All 6 of us working in relay, human and Veldrani and Gesari hands all moving together, which is a strange thing to see, but I wasn't thinking about that at the time. We got through the drift, the corridor opened up. And there it was, the shelter cache. A matte gray composite dome about 2 meters in diameter, half buried in a secondary drift that had come over the top of the ridge and settled in the corridor, but intact. The emergency seal light was green. Green meant the interior pressurization was maintained. Green meant the heating unit was still running. Green meant someone was inside. I got there first. Ithari was right behind me. I hit the emergency release on the external panel. The dome hissed and the seal broke and the door opened. She was sitting against the back wall with her knees pulled up and that orange parka pulled tight around her and the paper notebook open on her knees. She'd been writing. She was still writing. She looked up when the light came in. Then she looked at all of us standing there. Then she looked back down at her notebook. "I was going to finish this entry first," she said, "but I suppose it can wait." I stared at her. "You were," I started, then I stopped. "Then, are you okay?" "I'm fine," she held up the notebook. "I documented the strata exposure in the western face of the corridor before the storm hit. There are 2 additional thermal markers I hadn't mapped yet. I was writing up the preliminary assessment." She paused. "Also, these emergency rations are very good. Whoever packs them, they should know." I don't know exactly what expression I was making. I know Priya was laughing, quietly, but definitely laughing. Ithari had his secondary eyelids going absolutely wild. The 2 Gesari observers made a sound I'd never heard before, low and resonant, which I later learned was their equivalent of relief. "Dr. Alara," Commander Ithari said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard from him before. Something that wasn't purely informational. "We assessed your survival probability at threshold minimum." "I know," she said. "Your margins are based on exposure data for unprepared individuals." She stood up, methodical, brushing ice crystals off her parka. "I grew up in Iceland. I know what a blizzard sounds like before it arrives. I know how long it takes. I was in the shelter cache with 11 minutes to spare." She looked at Ithari. "Your weather projection was off by about 40 minutes. You should recalibrate." Ithari blinked. Yes, I will." Then she looked at me. For a second her face did the complicated thing again, the same expression I'd seen when she looked at the sky before heading back into the shelf. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then she bent down, picked up the secondary drill unit, which had been sitting right next to her the whole time, stowed neatly against the wall of the cache, and held it out. "Mission equipment," she said. "As requested. End of Part 1. Audio log continues. Transcription pauses for equipment recalibration. Estimated 4.2 hours of additional recording material. Part 2 begins on next document. Part 2. Document 2. Continued field recording transcript. Recovered audio-visual log, designation. Sovereign Reach Expedition, File 7 Kappa, continued. Narrated by Corporal Deven Marsh, 14th Frontier Survey Corps. Timeline, days 4-9 of mission. Post-blizzard survey operations. And post-mission debrief statement, submitted 14 days after recovery. Okay, so where I left off. And I realize I keep getting sidetracked by the small details, which is probably annoying if you're a mission analyst trying to extract usable data from this recording. But I'm going to ask you to bear with me because the small details are the whole point. Where I left off was Cass Alara coming out of that shelter cache with a mission report she'd written during a Category 4 Ketharan blizzard and handing over the secondary drill unit like she'd just stepped out of a supply room. That was day 4 morning, 5:17 local time. What happened over the next 5 days is what I really want to talk about. Because that's when the Veldrani started changing. Let me back up. and give you some context about the Veldrani that I didn't have when I first deployed. I knew the basic stuff from the briefings. Binary star system, moderately warm homeworld. Technically sophisticated, their engineering and materials science is probably about 40 years ahead of ours. Peaceful by disposition, not by naivety. They've had contact with 17 other spacefaring species. They've been operating in this galactic neighborhood for about 300 years longer than we have. What I didn't know, what nobody in the briefings had actually told us. Or maybe they'd told us, and I'd processed it as data without understanding what it meant, was how the Veldrani actually thought about physical risk. Their word for it is Veshkara. It doesn't translate perfectly. The closest approximation in English is something like appropriate vulnerability, the understood and accepted degree of risk that a rational being should accept in pursuit of a given goal. The Veldrani have a very sophisticated cultural framework around Veshkara. You accept exactly as much risk as is required and no more. Going beyond that isn't brave. Going beyond that is wasteful, irrational, and mildly offensive because it suggests you don't value your own existence appropriately. The emergency shelter cache was, from a Veldrani risk assessment standpoint, within Veshkara. Cass returning for the drill unit was on the outer edge of Veshkara. Surviving the blizzard in the shelter was acceptable Veshkara. Sitting in the shelter cache writing geological field notes during the blizzard was not Veshkara. It wasn't brave either, by Veldrani standards. It was something they didn't have a word for. I know this because Osavith told me, directly. On the morning of day 5, when we were out on the shelf again and the weather was clear and Cass was 50 meters ahead of us doing what she always did, moving fast, stopping, opening the notebook, moving again, Osavith fell into step beside me. "I have a question," he said. "Sure," I said. Dr. Alara in the shelter cache, during the Category 4 convergence, she was writing. "Yeah." Recording geological observations. "Yeah." Osavith's secondary eyelids did the flutter. She was not in distress. She said she wasn't. I have analyzed her physiological readings from the mission biometrics. Heart rate, respiratory pattern, cortisol indicators. From the point she entered the shelter cache until the moment we opened the seal. He paused. She was not in distress. She was another flutter, longer this time. She was calm, more calm in fact than her baseline readings during non-emergency survey operations. I thought about that. She was working, I said. Osavith looked at me, working. She had something to focus on, geological observations to document, a job to do, that calms her down. He was quiet for a moment. We have an extensive psychological profile of your species from 47 years of contact. I am familiar with stress response mechanisms, cortisol management, the role of task-focused cognition in anxiety reduction. Another flutter. What I am not familiar with is an individual whose stress response to isolation in a Category 4 planetary storm is to become calmer than baseline. Some people are like that, I said. Some humans, he said carefully. Yeah. This is documented. It's not that unusual. People who do high-risk work long enough, mountaineers, deep-sea divers, emergency responders, the work rewires something. The situation that terrifies everyone else is the situation they've trained for their whole lives. And when it arrives, it's almost like relief isn't the right word. Clarity, maybe. Everything becomes very simple. There's the situation and there's what you have to do about it, and everything else falls away. Osavith was quiet for a long time. Clarity, he said slowly, like he was turning the word over. We don't have an equivalent concept. In the presence of mortal danger, clarity is... He stopped. That is not a concept we would associate with calm. It's not calm exactly, I said. It's more like, I thought about Priya, in the Siberian storm system we'd trained in during our second year. The way she'd gone very quiet and very focused and moved with this terrible efficiency that looked almost like peace. It's like when the noise stops, when all the things you're usually thinking about stop mattering, and there's just the problem in front of you. Osavith looked ahead at Cass, who had stopped at a ridge formation and was running her hand along the face of it again, reading the ice. She experiences this regularly, he said. I think it might just be how she is, I said. We have a concept, Osavith said slowly, that we apply to the Ketharan ice shelf itself, to the planet. To Category 4 convergence events. he paused. It means a force that operates beyond rational engagement, something that simply acts according to its nature without consideration for response or resistance. He looked at me again. I think, he said carefully, that I may need to expand the category of things to which we apply that concept. Day 5 brought us to the primary thermal site. If Day 3 was the day the weather changed everything, Day 5 was the day the mission changed everything. The primary thermal site was a roughly 300-meter diameter depression in the shelf's surface where the ice was notably thinner. Satellite data had suggested 8 to 12 meters of ice over liquid water. Osivith's handheld sensors confirmed it. We were standing over a subsurface lake that had likely been liquid for tens of thousands of years. Commander Ithari deployed the primary geothermal drill unit. Farron set up the secondary, the one Cass had retrieved, as backup. The drilling process would take approximately 6 hours to reach the interface layer. While the drill ran, Cass circled the site perimeter with her instruments, mapping the ice thickness variations, taking core samples, documenting the surface crystal structure. She worked in a slow, methodical grid pattern, moving outward from the drill site in expanding arcs. I was on equipment watch, monitoring the drill telemetry, making sure the bit temperature stayed within operational parameters. Priya was running comms with the orbital station. The Gesari observers were doing their thing, standing very still and making very occasional notes in their own cryptic notation system. About 2 hours into the drill run, Cass came to me. I need to go out to the ridge, she said. It was the pressure ridge formation to the northeast, one she'd been looking at since we arrived. There's an exposed strata sequence there that I think it's significant. I need to get samples. How far? Maybe 200 meters. I checked the weather monitor. Clear, stable pressure. The storm had passed, and the next significant system was 20-plus hours out according to Ithari's recalibrated projections. Take a beacon, I said. Always do, she said. And a comm unit. She held one up, already in her hand. Check in every 20 minutes, I said. 15, she said, and walked. I watched her go, watched until the orange parka got small against the pale ice. Priya came over. She'll be fine. I know, I said. You know, or you know because she told you. Both, I said. Priya smiled, went back to her comms station. Here's something nobody tells you about planetary survey work. The part of the job that looks the most boring from the outside, standing next to a drill unit for 6 hours watching numbers, is actually the part that requires the most sustained concentration. Because the moment you stop watching numbers is the moment something goes wrong and you don't catch it in time. I watched the numbers. Cass checked in at 15 minutes. Ice thickness dropping here about 2 meters thinner than the main site. Could be a secondary lens. 20 minutes more. Found something in the strata, layering pattern I haven't seen before, taking extended core sample, may need an extra 20 minutes. Copy, I said. 15 minutes after that. Okay, this is actually interesting, Corporal. Define interesting. The strata sequence here shows 2 distinct thermal events separated by approximately 40,000 years, which suggests the lake system isn't continuous, it cycles. Freeze, melt, freeze, melt. Her voice had that quality I'd come to associate with her excited state, very slightly faster, the sentences a little more compressed. That changes the biological viability assessment completely. Good interesting or bad interesting? Exceptional interesting, she said. Can you tell Osivith to come look at the core samples when I get back? Will do. 14 minutes after that. Heading back, sample case is full. I need more sample containers. We've got them at the equipment station. Good 5 minutes. She made it back in 4. Osivith looked at her core samples for about 30 seconds and then made a sound that I'd never heard a Veldrani make before. It was sharp and high and then immediately suppressed, like he'd let something out and then caught it. His secondary eyelids went into a full-stop flutter. This layering pattern, he said. Thermal cycling signature, Cass said. 2 events 40,000 years apart. If the lake cycles, then any microbial life in there has evolved under periodic freeze-thaw pressure, which means potentially extreme adaptive capacity. and a life cycle synchronized to the thermal cycle, which means when we drill in. We're drilling in at the thaw stage, Osavith said. He looked up. He looked at Commander Ithari. We may find active biology, not dormant, active. Ithari was still. For a Veldrani, that level of stillness is roughly equivalent to a human sprinting across a room. Dr. Alara, he said, you identified this from surface strata alone. The core helps, she said. But yeah, the surface signature was visible if you knew what to look for. How long had you been looking at this formation? She considered. Since day one. The color variation at the surface edge caught my attention when we first came over the ridge. Ithari was quiet for a moment. Then, you observed a feature that our orbital survey instruments did not flag from a moving survey formation on the first day while simultaneously managing your field navigation. It was a color thing, Cass said. Orbital sensors aren't great with subtle tonal variation on reflective surfaces. Human eyes are pretty good at it. She paused. Also, I just think about ice a lot. The drill reached the interface layer at 1847 hours, 6 hours and 12 minutes after deployment. Farron handled the transition from drill to sample collection with the secondary unit standing by. The moment the sensor array hit liquid water, the readout changed, temperature spike, pressure equilibration, and then the data started coming in. Osavith was at the display before the first readings fully rendered. He was still for a long moment. Then he said, biological indicators are positive. Nobody moved. Positive at what level? Ithari asked. Density reading suggests significant colony presence. Osavith's voice had lost most of its modulation. The flatness was gone. He sounded in that moment almost human. This is not trace indicators, this is. Commander, this is a living ecosystem. 40 light years from Earth, under 9 meters of ice on a planet that gets to negative 92 degrees in a Category 4 storm. There was something alive. We stood there, all of us, human and Veldrani and Gesari, around a drill hole in the ice, and nobody said anything for almost 2 full minutes. It was Cass who broke the silence. Of course it was. I'll need to revise my strata report, she said. The biological component changes the thermal cycle interpretation significantly. She already had the notebook out. The rest of Day 5 and all of Day 6 were documentation operations. Osavith was working at a pace I'd never seen a Veldrani work at. He and Cass essentially set up a parallel data collection operation, cross-referencing her geological findings with his biological readings, building a model of the lake system that incorporated both the cycling thermal history and the current biological status. I spent a lot of that time watching. Not the instruments, watching the team. Commander Ithari had undergone a specific transformation that I couldn't quite name at the time, but have thought about a lot since. In the mission's first 3 days, he'd been what I expected a coalition mission commander to be: organized, thorough, competent, correct. Running the mission by the parameters and the protocols and the risk assessments. Doing everything right. After the blizzard, he was different. Not in how he ran the mission. The mission operations were as correct as ever. It was something else. Something in how he watched things, how he processed what was happening around him. I caught him once, Day 6, around mid-morning, standing about 10 meters from where Cass was working. Just watching her. She'd found another strata sequence she wanted to document, and she dropped to her knees on the ice, and she was working with a fine bristle instrument to clear the surface crystal from a sample point. Very careful, very focused, head bent over the work. Ithari stood there for probably 5 minutes watching her work. I went and stood next to him. Commander, Corporal Marsh. We watched her for a moment. I have been revising my probability models, he said. Which ones? The general class of models that concern human performance in extreme environmental conditions. He was quiet for a moment. We have 47 years of contact data. Our models are, statistically, quite reliable at the population level. But, at the individual level, he said slowly, I am finding that the models contain a category error. What kind of category error? The models treat extreme environment as a performance-limiting variable, he said. Exposure to extreme cold, extreme danger, extreme physiological stress. The models predict performance degradation, a progressive reduction in function. He watched Cass lift a core sample and hold it up to the pale light. They do not account for individuals for whom the extreme environment is a performance-neutral or, he paused, or performance-enhancing variable. You mean people who do better under pressure, I said. Yes, but that phrase, under pressure, it contains the assumption of degradation. Pressure degrades. It is the nature of pressure. Another pause. Dr. Alara is not degraded. She is not merely under pressure. She is. He stopped. She's in her element, I said. He looked at me. Explain this phrase. It's like she belongs there. She's built for it. The cold, the storm, the hard conditions, they're not things she's enduring. They're the context she needs to work in. Take them away and she might actually perform worse. I thought about this. Some people are like tropical fish. They need a certain specific environment to thrive. She's more like I tried to think of the right analogy. Like a storm petrel, a seabird. It lives on the ocean's surface. Massive waves, constant wind, freezing spray, that's not survival for it. That's where it lives. That's its natural state. Ithari processed this in silence for a long time. We have a designation in coalition taxonomy, he finally said, for organisms that are specifically adapted to extreme environmental niches, that are not merely surviving those niches but that are optimized for them. He paused. We have never applied that designation to an intelligent species. Well, I said. He looked at me. I said. You haven't met that many of us yet. Day 7 was when the Gesari observers finally started talking. They'd been on the mission for 7 days, and in that entire time, combined, I think I'd heard maybe 40 words from them. Their designations in the mission paperwork were Observer Gesari 1 and Observer Gesari 2, which is bureaucratically accurate and also completely unhelpful as a way to think about actual beings. Cass started calling them reed and branch because she said they moved like river reeds, that slightly underwater quality, like the air was a little thicker around them. Observer Gesari 1 was taller and moved fractionally slower, so that was reed. Observer Gesari 2 was branch. On day 7 morning, when we were suiting up for the first surface shift, Branch came to me. They communicated through a combination of their own native sound and a translation module they wore on what I would call their collarbone. The translation module had been calibrated during the mission briefings. It turned their sound into English with a slight delay and a processing artifact that made the translated voice sound like it was coming from slightly farther away than it actually was. We have a question, Branch said. Sure, I said. The human, Dr. Alara. Yeah. She is the one who went back, Branch said. Through the translation module it sounded declarative, but I'd started to learn that Gesari phrasing style worked differently than it appeared. They stated things they were asking about as facts first, and then waited. She went back for the drill unit, yeah. In the approaching convergence. Yes. Branch was quiet for a moment. Reed drifted closer. Our cultural observers, Branch said, they have recorded many instances of this in human history. An individual who accepts risk disproportionate to personal gain for the benefit of the collective. Self-sacrifice, I said, or bravery depending on how it turns out. Your culture assigns this high value. Most cultures do, some version of it. Our culture does not, Branch said, not with any emotion, just factual. In Gesari social structure, the individual is not separable from the collective in the way your species conceives. Risk to an individual is risk to the collective. There is no calculation to be made. Risk is risk. It is always undesirable and always to be minimized. I see, I said. But I have been observing Dr. Alara, Branch said, for 7 days. And... A long pause. Reed made that low, resonant sound again. The sound I'd learned was relief or something adjacent to it. She does not calculate risk the way your briefing suggested humans calculate risk, Branch said. The briefing suggested humans accept risk reluctantly when the benefit calculation overcomes the survival instinct. Another pause. She does not appear to experience the survival instinct in the way the briefing described. She experiences it, I said. She's not reckless, she had a plan. She knew the shelter cache was there. She knew she had the kit and the time and the knowledge to make it. Yes, Branch said. This is what we do not understand. She calculated. She planned. She moved with precision. the translated voice with its slight delay, always a half-second behind the mouth. And then she sat in the shelter cache during a Category 4 convergence and she wrote in her book. She wrote her observations, I said. She wrote, Branch repeated slowly, her observations. They stood there for a moment, Reed and Branch, in that still underwater way. We think, Branch said finally, that your species may have a different relationship with mortality than any species we have previously observed. How so? I said. Other species, Branch said, run from death. Or accept death or make peace with death. A pause, you write notes. I thought about that for a second. Then I started laughing. I don't know why exactly. It was just the precise accuracy of it. It was just so exactly right. You write notes. As a characterization of what Casa Lara had done, it was perfect. It was completely, exactly, perfectly what had happened. Branch and Reed observed me laughing for a moment. Then Branch said, we did not intend this to be humorous. I know, I said, still laughing. That's what makes it funny. Day 8 was quieter. The sample collection was complete. Osivith had enough biological data to confirm the discovery. Ithari had drafted the preliminary report, a subsurface liquid water ecosystem with active biological colonies, thermally cycled, environmentally extreme by any coalition standard, and alive. Alive. The confirmation would trigger a whole reclassification process for the sector. New planetary protections, new research designations. It would take years to work through the coalition bureaucracy, but the data was in and the data was clear. That evening, with the extraction team scheduled for 600 the following morning, the survey team made camp one final time on the shelf. We sat outside the shelter for a while. That sounds insane, sitting outside on a negative 62-degree planetary ice shelf for leisure. But we had our thermal gear, and the weather was still, and the sky over Cathara 9 at night is something I want to describe properly before I lose the chance. The binary star system meant even at night, the sky wasn't fully dark. The companion star was visible from the shelf, a small, bright point that shed enough light to give the ice a faint luminescence. And Cathara 9 had 2 moons, both irregularly shaped, both active. They caught the starlight and threw it back in these strange, non-uniform patterns that made the ice shelf shimmer and shift. We were sitting on that. Sitting on a shimmering, luminescent, alien ice shelf under a sky with 2 moons and a companion star, in the aftermath of a discovery that was going to rewrite coalition planetary classification standards. Priya had produced, from somewhere in the depths of her field pack, a small thermal flask and 6 portions of something that she described as masala chai, sort of approximate, which she'd been nursing through the mission for a moment exactly like this. She distributed it. Ithari and Osivith accepted their portions with some uncertainty, and then, I think, genuine appreciation. Farron tried his and tilted his head in that Veldrani gesture that seems to mean unexpected but acceptable. The 2 Gesari observers declined politely. They stood slightly apart, which was their usual way. Cass had the notebook out, of course, but she wasn't writing. She had it closed, resting on her knee, and she was looking at the sky. You know, she said, not to anyone specifically, when I first put in for this mission, my department head told me I was wasting my time. He said there was no chance of an active biology find on an ice shelf survey in this sector. He said go to Marathi 6 instead. Very promising geological structures, he said. Why didn't you? Priya asked. Marathi 6 primary geological structures are basaltic formations from a volcanic event about 2 million years ago. Cass said this like she was explaining why she'd chosen the clearly better restaurant. Nice work if you want a stable, well-understood system. Not interesting if you want to understand something about how life persists under pressure. Is that what you want to understand? I said. She looked at me, the same complicated expression. In the strange, doubled moonlight of Cathara 9, it was a little easier to read. It wasn't complicated, exactly. It was just deep. Like whatever she was looking at when she made that face was something she'd been looking at for a long time. I grew up in Iceland, she said. We had a phrase, a very old Icelandic thing, goes back to the saga tradition, Theta Redest, which loosely means something like it will all work out. But that's not quite right. It's more like things have a tendency to resolve. The world has a tendency to continue. Even when it looks like it won't. She looked back up at the sky. I've been in 3 blizzards worse than that Category 4. I've been stuck on ice for 4 days with a broken GPS and a damaged heating unit. There were moments where the math said I was done. She was quiet for a moment. And then it worked out. Not because I was lucky, because I kept working, because the ice is always trying to tell you something, and if you're paying attention, you find the thing you need. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Osivith said, "We found active biology." "We found active biology," Cass agreed. "Because you noticed a color variation on the first day." "The ice was telling me something," she said simply. Commander Ithari made a sound I hadn't heard from him before. Low and deliberate, I looked at him. "Commander," Priya said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have led 17 planetary survey missions," he said. "This is the first in which I have had cause to significantly revise my understanding of a species I believed I had adequate data on." "Which species?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew. "Yours," he said. He looked at Cass, then at me, then at Priya. "Your medical and biological data, your historical records, your sociological reports, your previous contact representatives, they are all coherent and internally consistent." He paused. "They do not, however, fully prepare one for this." He seemed to not have a word for this. "The practical reality." "We're a weird species," Priya offered. "Yes," Ithari said. And the way he said it, it wasn't an insult. It was more like someone who'd been studying a piece of music from the sheet and had just heard it performed for the first time. Slightly awed, slightly thrown, recalibrating. "The storm," he said. "Dr. Alara, sitting in the cache during the Category 4, writing. When I was told she might be, when I ran the survival probabilities, I made a correct calculation based on available data." A pause. "I should have factored for the human who was in the storm." Cass looked at him. "You couldn't have known," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I should have had enough data by day 3 to know that my models were insufficient for the individual." He paused. "The blizzard began to roar, and I assumed it was over for you." Cass was quiet. "I'm from Iceland," she said finally. "The blizzard roaring is just the beginning of the interesting part." Day 9. Extraction at 600 local time. The shuttle from the orbital station came down through the pale lavender atmosphere like a silver needle, and we loaded out in 2 hours flat. I did the thing soldiers do when they're leaving a place that's been significant. I stood outside for an extra few minutes while the others loaded gear, looked at the shelf, the ice formations, the sky doing its thing. Priya came and stood next to me. "So," she said. "So," I said. "What do you think they're going to do with us? The core, I mean. First active exobiology discovery in 3 years. That's a lot of attention." "Probably some kind of briefing cycle," I said. "Debriefs, interviews." "The whole thing. You okay with that?" I thought about it. "Yeah," I said. "Yeah, I think so." "The Veldrani are going to change how they train their survey teams," Priya said. "Ithari told me last night. He's going to write a formal proposal. He wants to include human personnel on all future cold environment missions in this sector." "Because of one data point," I said. Priya gave me a look. "Because of a data point named Dr. Cass Alara, who went back into a Category 4 Ketharan blizzard for a drill unit, and came out with geological notes and active biology indicators, and enough intellectual composure to correct the commander's weather projection." "Fair," I said. We stood there for another minute. "The Gesari told me something," Priya said. "Branch or Reed?" She looked at me sideways. "You know, they actually seemed pleased when I used those names. I think Cass." She shook her head, smiling. "Branch told me that in their observation tradition they assign a classification to each mission, a category, based on the nature of the events they observed and what those events revealed." "What classification did they give this one?" "They have a category," Priya said slowly. "That translates roughly as a mission in which a wrong assumption was corrected." She paused. "They said this is their highest category, because wrong assumptions in their view are the most dangerous things in the universe. More dangerous than Category 4 blizzards, more dangerous than bad equipment. More dangerous than unexplored terrain." She looked at me. "They said the human corrected the wrong assumption." "Which wrong assumption?" "That she was dead." I looked at the shelf. "She was never dead," I said. "No," Priya agreed. "She was just working." We cleared the atmosphere at 9:11 local time on day 9. Through the shuttle window, Cathara 9 pulled away slowly, the way planets always do, like they don't want to let you go, which is scientifically inaccurate but emotionally very real. The ice shelf got small. The pressure ridges and the formations and the drill site and the emergency shelter cache and the eastern corridor and all of it small, then smaller, then a white region on a pale surface, then just surface. Cass was sitting across the aisle from me. She had the notebook open, writing up the thermal cycling model. She'd barely stopped since we'd gotten on the shuttle. I watched her write for a while. Then I said, "Can I ask you something?" She looked up, "Sure." "In the shelter cache during the storm, were you ever scared?" She considered this, not dismissively, actually thought about it. "There was a moment," she said, "when the storm peaked around hour 18. The cache was holding fine, but the sound was," she paused. "You've been in it, you know." "Yeah." "There was a moment where the sound changed, like the frequency dropped, and for about 30 seconds I wasn't sure if the cache was going to hold." She looked down at the notebook. "I closed the notebook for those 30 seconds. I thought about that. 30 seconds out of 31 hours. And then," I said, "and then the frequency went back up, the cache held." She opened the notebook again, and I went back to work. I nodded slowly. "The thing about working," she said, "is that it keeps the fear in proportion. You're scared, but the work is right there, and the work needs doing, and so you do it." She looked at me. "Fear is just information. It's telling you something is dangerous, but you usually already know it's dangerous, so the fear is redundant. The work is not redundant." I sat with that for a while. "You know," I said, "when we came through that drift at the corridor and got the cache open and the light hit you," I stopped. "What?" "I've seen that thing they describe in the briefings. Combat stress response, battle shock, the eyes that aren't quite tracking. I've seen it in people who have been through bad stuff." I paused. "You were just sitting there with the notebook." "I know," she said. "It threw me." "I know," she said again. She smiled slightly, the first unguarded smile I'd seen from her in 9 days. "You looked like you'd expected to find a body and found a person instead." "That's roughly accurate," I said. "That's what I figured." She looked back at the notebook. "For what it's worth, I heard you talking to Sergeant Salve through the shelter walls. The acoustics in that corridor are interesting, very good conduction through the ice. You said something right before you opened the seal." I thought back. She made the cache. Said it with more certainty than I had. "Yeah," I said. "You said it like you believed it," she said. "Like you actually believed it." "I did," I said. "By that point I did." She nodded slowly, went back to writing. After a moment, "Thank you, Corporal." "Marsh," I said. "Deven." She looked up. "Mission's over," I said. "Deven's fine." "Cass," she said, went back to writing. "Post-mission debrief addendum. Submitted, Corporal Deven Marsh, 14th Frontier Survey Corps. Filed, 14 days post-mission. United Earth Expeditionary Division Review Board, New Geneva Station. I've given you the operational timeline in the formal report. What I want to add here is what I think this mission actually means. And I know that's not what a post-mission debrief addendum is supposed to be. You want data, incident reports, protocol assessments, the things that go in the training revisions. I'll give you those, I have them. But I also want to say this. 47 years of contact with the Veldrani Coalition. 18 years of contact with the Gesari Observers. 7 other spacefaring species we've met and made formal agreements within the time since Earth joined the broader galactic community. In all of that time, in all of those contacts and negotiations and joint operations and cultural exchanges, we have been trying to figure out where we fit. What we bring to this. Why the species who have been out here 300 years before us and who have technologies that make ours look like stone tools would want to partner with us on anything. What our contribution to the galactic community is supposed to be. I think I have part of an answer now. And I know it sounds strange, coming from a planetary survey mission on an ice shelf, but hear me out. Commander Ithari told me something on the last night, after the Theta Redast conversation. He said that in 47 years of contact, the Veldrani understanding of humanity had been built on reports and data and cultural analysis and representative samples. He said the understanding was accurate. He said it was statistically well-grounded. And then he said, none of our data prepared us for watching a human sit in an ice shelter during a Category 4 convergence event and write geological field notes. Not because it was reckless, not because it was irrational. Because it was, in his words, evidence of a relationship with the physical world that we do not have a model for. The Veldrani model extreme cold as a threat. The Gesari model extreme isolation as a degradation variable. They're right. Those are accurate models for most intelligent species, apparently. Death aversion is a galactic constant. But Casolera sat in a storm and wrote notes. And that specific, precise human thing that changed how two alien species thought about us. Not because it proved we were tough. Not because it proved we were brave. Because it proved we were something they hadn't accounted for. Something different. Something that looks at the worst thing the universe can throw at it and says, interesting. Let me document this. I grew up partly in Canada. I know cold. I know what it does to you and what it takes out of you and how it narrows everything down. But I had never, before Cathara 9, fully understood what it means to be built for something. To have a relationship with a difficult thing that is not adversarial. That is almost comfortable, natural, home. That's what the ice is for Cass. Not a threat, not an obstacle. The context. The environment she was built for. And in that environment, she found a living ecosystem under 9 meters of ice that the Coalition's orbital instruments had missed. She found it because she looked, and she looked because cold places full of hard conditions are her natural habitat, and in her natural habitat she doesn't go to survival mode. She goes to work mode. The Gesari said it, you write notes. Yeah, that's what we do.